The psychological phenomenon of cognitive dissonance is never more apparent than within the mahogany-paneled boardrooms of dynastic real estate empires, where unearned arrogance consistently trumps actual intellectual competence. For the past 6 years, I have occupied a meticulously curated, albeit strategically marginalized, position within Sterling Developments, the multi-billion-dollar architectural conglomerate founded by my father, Arthur Sterling. To the external world, and especially to my father and my insufferably mediocre older brother, Leo, I was merely the aesthetic enhancement specialist. In their dismissive, deeply misogynistic lexicon, I was just a decorator, a glorified interior designer whose only contribution to our massive luxury housing developments was selecting the exact shade of eggshell white for the penthouses and coordinating the velvet upholstery for the lobby lounges. They viewed my presence as a benevolent act of familial charity, a way to keep the artistic daughter occupied while the real men engaged in the high-stakes, multi-million-dollar engineering and structural development of our newest, most ambitious project, the Meridian Spire. This 72-story luxury residential complex was intended to be the crown jewel of the Sterling legacy, a massive, glass-facaded monument to Leo's perceived architectural genius. What Arthur and Leo completely, almost comically, failed to comprehend was that while I was ostensibly obsessing over silk drapes and Italian marble finishes, I was secretly utilizing my double degree, a master in interior architecture and a clandestine, high-honors PhD in structural engineering from a top-tier global university, to quietly fix the catastrophic, amateurish mistakes Leo constantly embedded within the foundational blueprints. Leo was a creature of aesthetic vanity, a man who prioritized visual impact over the fundamental laws of structural physics, frequently demanding dangerous, cantilevered balconies and impossibly thin load-bearing columns that would have inevitably resulted in a catastrophic systemic collapse had I not been secretly, manually recalibrating the metallurgical specifications behind his back for years. The breaking point arrived during the high-pressure, televised unveiling ceremony of the Meridian Spire's final construction phase, an event attended by the city's most influential political figures and international institutional investors. As we stood on the precarious, unfinished 72nd floor, surrounded by the skeletal frame of the building, my father publicly announced that Leo would be officially assuming the role of Chief Operating Officer, effectively handing him the keys to the entire Sterling empire. During the subsequent celebratory dinner, when I tentatively suggested that the latest revisions to the Spire's foundation, revisions Leo had made without my aesthetic input, might possess a microscopic margin of error regarding seismic resistance, Leo erupted into a fit of patronizing, performative laughter that silenced the entire room. "Listen to me, Maya," he hissed, his voice dripping with a toxic cocktail of unearned superiority and champagne-fueled condescension. "You deal with the pillows, the paints, and the pretty little light fixtures. Leave the structural integrity and the engineering to the people who actually have the intellectual capacity to understand the physics of a skyscraper. You're just a decorator, and frankly, your constant, uneducated interference in the technical aspects of this firm has become a financial liability. As of this moment, Sterling Developments no longer requires your design services. Consider yourself officially, permanently terminated from the family business. We'll have a junior assistant finish the wallpapering. It's not like it requires a brain." My father, instead of defending the daughter who had silently saved his reputation dozens of times, simply looked at his wine glass and nodded in silent, cowardly agreement with Leo's arrogant decree. I was publicly stripped of my access badges, humiliated in front of our entire executive board, and physically escorted out of the building by security guards I had known since childhood. As the heavy glass doors of the Sterling Tower locked behind me, Julian and Arthur were already clinking glasses, celebrating their perceived liberation from my uninformed opinions. They genuinely believed they had finally amputated the weak, artistic link in their corporate chain, remaining spectacularly, dangerously oblivious to the fact that I wasn't just the decorator of the Meridian Spire. I was the only person on the planet who knew exactly how many fatal, uncertified structural compromises were currently hidden beneath the building's glossy, expensive skin. They called me a decorator to diminish my worth, so I decided I would give them exactly what they deserved. A building that looked like a masterpiece on the surface, but was mathematically, legally, and structurally a hollow, uncertified tomb waiting for the first sign of pressure to expose the frauds who built it. The psychological liberation inherent in no longer being the invisible, uncredited custodian of another person's catastrophic incompetence is a sensation that borders on the sublime. For 6 years, I had functioned as the silent, structural marrow of sterling developments, anonymously reinforcing the brittle, poorly calculated skeletons of my brother, Leo's architectural vanities, while he basked in the unearned adoration of the city's elite. Upon being unceremoniously, publicly purged from the executive suites of the Sterling Tower, I did not retreat into a state of paralyzed, emotional defeat. Instead, I drove my unassuming vehicle directly to my clandestine operational sanctuary, a highly secured, subterranean technical loft located in the city's industrial district, entirely independent of the Sterling corporate network. Within this climate-controlled environment, surrounded by high-performance workstations and calibrated structural modeling software, I possess the actual, verified credentials they so arrogantly assumed I lacked. A doctoral degree in structural engineering, with a specialized focus on high-rise metallurgical fatigue and seismic dampening systems. My father and brother genuinely believed that my 6-year tenure was spent obsessing over textile swatches and chandelier aesthetics, completely oblivious to the fact that I had secretly archived every single original, flawed blueprint Leo had ever produced, alongside my own unauthorized, corrective revisions that had, until now, prevented his buildings from catastrophic systemic collapse. The Meridian Spire, the 72-story monstrosity currently reaching its critical vertical mass, was particularly vulnerable. Leo, in his infinite, uneducated hubris, had recently overruled my aesthetic suggestions regarding the grade 80 high-strength steel reinforcement for the primary load-bearing shear walls, unilaterally substituting them with a cheaper, substandard alloy provided by one of his corrupt, kickback-paying offshore vendors to pad the quarterly profit margins. He believed the building's outer glass skin would mask the metallurgical inferiority of its core, but to my surgically trained engineering eyes, the spire was no longer a luxury residence. It was a vertical disaster waiting for a microscopic seismic trigger. I sat before my multi-monitor array, the blue light reflecting in my eyes as I initiated a comprehensive, high-fidelity structural stress simulation, utilizing Leo's original, uncorrected specifications, the very specifications he was currently using to finalize the upper residential floors. The simulation results were spectacularly, terrifyingly conclusive. The building's wind sway oscillation at altitudes exceeding 400 feet would induce an irreversible stress fracture cascade within the primary cantilevered support beams within 24 months of completion. I didn't need to plant explosives or engage in physical sabotage. I simply had to stop being the invisible glue holding Leo's delusions together. I leaned back, watching the digital model of the Meridian Spire crumble into a pile of red, non-compliant pixels on my screen, and I felt a cold, mathematical serenity wash over me. I wasn't just going to watch it fail. I was going to ensure that the municipal building commissions, the international insurance underwriters, and the federal safety regulators saw exactly what I saw, not through the lens of a scorned decorator, but through the indisputable, peer-reviewed expertise of a certified structural engineer whose credentials would render Leo's unearned authority absolutely, historically obsolete. The decertification process wouldn't just halt construction. It would effectively turn the Sterling family legacy into a radioactive financial asset that no bank on the planet would touch. Arthur and Leo had spent years telling me I was just a decorator who didn't understand physics, so I decided to show them exactly what happens when the laws of physics are no longer being manipulated in their favor by the person they just threw away. The juxtaposition of public-facing architectural arrogance and the private reality of structural insolvency is a spectacle that only a trained engineer can truly appreciate with the cold, calculating detachment it deserves. Exactly 3 weeks after my unceremonious, public expulsion from the Sterling executive hierarchy, Leo orchestrated a grotesque, high-budget, topping-out ceremony at the Meridian Spire, a performative celebration intended to mark the placement of the final structural beam atop the 72-story monstrosity. Surrounded by local politicians, high-net-worth institutional investors, and a swarm of fawning architectural journalists, Leo stood on a temporary stage in the shadow of the spire, wearing an expensive, tailored hard hat and an even more expensive smirk, loudly proclaiming his revolutionary engineering methods as the new global gold standard for luxury high-rise development. He stood there, intoxicated by the flash of camera bulbs and the artificial, sycophantic applause of individuals who lacked the intellectual capacity to understand that the building looming above them was a metallurgical ticking time bomb. While he was delivering his practiced, megalomaniacal monologue about pushing the boundaries of modern design, I was seated in my darkened operational sanctuary, executing a meticulously timed, multi-layered digital strike against the very foundations of his unearned legacy. Utilizing a secure, untraceable encrypted relay, I submitted a comprehensive, 200-page technical dossier directly to the highest investigative echelons of the Municipal Building Safety Commission and the National Architectural Integrity Board. This was not the emotional manifesto of a disgruntled former employee. It was a devastatingly precise, peer-reviewed forensic analysis of the spire's primary load-bearing infrastructure, documented with high-resolution metallurgical scans and my own clandestine, unauthorized stress tests that conclusively proved the grade 80 steel substitutes Leo had utilized were suffering from significant, accelerated molecular fatigue. I explicitly detailed how the building's cantilevered residential wings, the very features Leo was currently bragging about, exceeded the safety margins for wind load oscillation by an astronomical 45%. As Leo was ceremoniously signing a commemorative golden beam for the cameras, the lead commissioner of building safety was simultaneously reading my forensic report and watching a synchronized digital simulation of the building's inevitable systemic collapse under peak hurricane force conditions. The reaction from the municipal authorities was not a slow, bureaucratic crawl. It was a spectacular, instantaneous mobilization of emergency regulatory power. Just as the celebratory champagne was being uncorked at the gala, 3 unmarked, black government SUVs aggressively breached the perimeter of the construction site, and a phalanx of grim-faced, uncompromising structural inspectors, armed with an immediate, non-negotiable federal cease and desist order, marched directly onto the stage, effectively hijacking Leo's televised moment of triumph. The cameras didn't capture the final beam placement. They captured the undeniable, high-definition image of my brother's face violently draining of color as the inspectors officially shut down the most expensive construction project in the city's history. They didn't care about his vision or his legacy. They cared about the cold, mathematical reality that the Meridian Spire was currently a vertical hazard. I watched the live-streamed feed of the ensuing chaos, seeing my father frantically attempting to bribe the lead inspector with promises of political favors, while Leo stood paralyzed in a state of unadulterated, weeping shock. And I realized that the decertification process hadn't just begun. It was already vaporizing the Sterling family's multi-billion-dollar valuation in real time. The Decorator had finally introduced the laws of physics to the boardroom, and the resulting explosion was a masterpiece of bureaucratic destruction. The immediate, visceral aftermath of a multi-billion-dollar corporate decapitation is a spectacle of pure, unadulterated chaos that no amount of expensive public relations training can successfully mitigate. As the federal and municipal inspectors officially cordoned off the Meridian Spire, transforming Leo's celebratory stage into a highly scrutinized forensic crime scene, the carefully manufactured veneer of the Sterling family's invincibility began to liquefy with terrifying velocity. I sat within the silent, dimly lit sanctuary of my subterranean technical loft, watching the frantic, high-definition feeds from my hijacked security perimeter as my father, Arthur, and my brother, Leo, retreated into their mobile command center, a custom-built, luxury armored trailer, to escape the predatory swarms of international journalists now scenting the blood of a massive architectural scandal. Their psychological deterioration was spectacularly pathetic to witness. Leo, his expensive silk tie disheveled, and his face contorted into a mask of hyperventilating panic, was desperately screaming into his encrypted smartphone, unsuccessfully attempting to intimidate the city's chief building official with hollow threats of political retaliation that no longer possessed any actual leverage. My father, the supposedly stoic architect of the Sterling legacy, sat in the corner of the trailer, his hands trembling as he stared at the red-stamped federal stop work order that had effectively vaporized 40% of his net worth in a single trading afternoon. They were still operating under the delusional assumption that this was merely a clerical anomaly or a coordinated act of industrial sabotage by a rival developer, completely failing to comprehend the catastrophic mathematical reality of the 200-page technical dossier I had unleashed upon them. In their state of profound, sweat-soaked desperation, they did something I had meticulously anticipated. They attempted to contact me. My smartphone, resting on the cold steel of my workstation, began vibrating with a relentless, rhythmic intensity as Leo's name flashed across the screen for the first time since he had unceremoniously fired me for being just a decorator. I didn't answer. I simply watched the voicemail transcriptions materialize in real time, pathetic, contradictory messages that shifted from arrogant demands for my immediate return to the office to manipulate the archival, aesthetic records, to weeping, insincere apologies for the misunderstandings of our last meeting. They believed that I, the supposedly naive sister who obsessed over wallpaper and fabric swatches, might possess some forgotten, secondary set of blueprints or metallurgical certifications that could somehow contradict the damning forensic evidence the inspectors were currently utilizing to dismantle their reputations. They were desperately searching for a metaphorical life raft in a storm I had personally engineered, and they were trying to use the very person they had publicly humiliated to provide it. While they were frantically attempting to bribe mid-level inspectors and find a loophole in the seismic regulations, I was busy executing the secondary phase of their annihilation. I began systematically contacting the primary institutional investors and the high-profile celebrity tenants who had already paid massive, non-refundable deposits for the Spire's penthouse suites. Using an anonymous, encrypted legal handle, I provided these stakeholders with a microscopic, undeniably terrifying summary of the building's structural instability, explicitly detailing the high probability of a catastrophic metallurgical failure during a sustained wind event. I wasn't just stopping the construction. I was poisoning the entire financial ecosystem surrounding the project, ensuring that even if they somehow managed to bypass the municipal inspectors, the very people funding their empire would withdraw their capital with the violent, uncompromising speed of a shark, scenting a mortal wound in the water. Leo and Arthur had spent decades building a kingdom on the assumption that the decorators of the world were too intellectually insignificant to see the rot in the foundation. And as I watched them collapse into a heap of terrified, incompetent silence on my monitors, I realized they were about to discover that a woman who understands the physics of collapse is the most dangerous architect they could ever encounter. The psychological atmosphere within the sprawling, mahogany-clad executive sanctuary of the Sterling family estate was thick with the suffocating, acidic stench of terminal desperation and unadulterated, sweat-soaked panic. Exactly 48 hours after the municipal authorities had officially transformed the Meridian Spire into a multi-billion-dollar architectural graveyard, my father, Arthur, and my brother, Leo, summoned me for an emergency family council, a pathetic euphemism for the absolute, groveling surrender they were about to attempt. I arrived precisely 6 minutes late, intentionally projecting the image of the vapid, technically insignificant decorator they had spent decades patronizing, wearing a soft silk dress and carrying a designer portfolio filled with meaningless fabric swatches to maintain the elaborate masquerade of my perceived incompetence. As I entered the room, the contrast between our current realities was spectacularly, almost comically stark. Leo, previously the arrogant monarch of luxury development, was now a disheveled, hyperventilating wreck of a man, his eyes bloodshot and his hands trembling as he clutched a glass of straight bourbon at 10 o'clock in the morning. My father sat at the head of the table, his skin resembling a sheet of translucent, gray parchment, his once indomitable authority entirely evaporated under the crushing weight of the multi-jurisdictional federal safety audit currently dismantling his reputation. "Maya, darling, thank you for coming," my father began, his voice cracking with a forced, nauseatingly insincere warmth that made my skin crawl with visceral disgust. "Leo and I have had some time to reflect on our recent professional disagreements, and we realized that we were perhaps a bit too hasty in our assessment of your contributions to the Meridian Spire project." I didn't interrupt. I simply sat down and opened my portfolio, carefully arranging a set of velvet samples on the table, watching with a cold, mathematical detachment as Leo leaned forward, his voice a frantic, desperate hiss. "Look, Maya, we're in a bit of a localized technical predicament with the building inspectors. Those bureaucratic idiots are obsessing over some microscopic metallurgical variations in the sheer walls, and we need you to help us recategorize the internal design specifications. Since you were the one managing the interior architectural logs, we need you to refine the records to show that the grade 80 steel substitutions were actually part of a sophisticated, aesthetic load-bearing design you conceived for the penthouses." A slow, terrifyingly calm realization settled in my mind as I listened to them openly invite me to participate in a massive, multi-million-dollar criminal conspiracy to defraud federal safety regulators. They weren't asking for my artistic input. They were desperately begging the Decorator to commit a felony by forging technical documentation to hide the structural rot that was currently threatening to bankrupt our entire lineage. They believed that because I was family, I would naturally sacrifice my own legal integrity to shield them from the consequences of their monumental, sociopathic hubris. "So, you want me to utilize my uneducated interference to fabricate a metallurgical narrative that doesn't exist?" I asked, my voice remaining softly curious, masking the cold, clinical rage that was vibrating beneath the surface of my consciousness. Leo, missing the obvious trap, nodded frantically, sliding a thick, illegally edited digital tablet toward me. "Exactly. If you can just sign off on these revised interior structural logs, the inspectors will have to back off, the decertification will be lifted, and we can get the institutional investors back on board. We'll give you a 20% equity stake in the entire Sterling conglomerate and a permanent, unchallengeable seat on the board. You can buy every fabric mill in Italy for all I care. Just fix this, Maya." I looked at the digital tablet, seeing the blatant forgeries and the catastrophic, lethal compromises they were asking me to validate, and I felt a profound sense of closure. They still viewed me as a tool, a decorative accessory they could manipulate to hide their structural crimes. They had no idea that while I was sitting there, quietly listening to their desperate, illegal proposition, I was secretly wearing a high-fidelity, military-grade digital recording device that was currently transmitting every single word of their confession directly to the encrypted servers of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's White-Collar Crime Division. I closed my portfolio with a soft, final click, standing up and offering them a serene, enigmatic smile that they mistakenly interpreted as unconditional capitulation. "I'll need to review the specific metallurgical specifications tonight at my private studio before I can officially refine the logs, Leo," I whispered, watching the pathetic wave of relief wash over them. As I walked out of the estate and into the cool afternoon air, I realized that I didn't need to wait for the building to collapse to destroy them. They had just handed me the exact, irrefutable evidence required to ensure that they would spend the next several decades of their lives inside a structure whose integrity was managed by the Department of Corrections. The Decorator had just finished her final masterpiece, and the frame was about to be made of heavy, reinforced federal steel. The profound, systemic humiliation of individuals who have built their entire identities upon the fragile, translucent scaffolding of unearned architectural prestige, is a spectacle that requires the cold, unwavering precision of a structural autopsy. Exactly 72 hours after my father and brother had pathetically, illegally attempted to bribe me into forging the Meridian Spire's metallurgical logs, the meticulously coordinated hammer of federal justice descended upon the glass and steel headquarters of Sterling Developments with the terrifying velocity of a terminal structural failure. I did not watch this particular collapse from the shadows of my subterranean laboratory. Instead, I arrived at the corporate plaza precisely 3 minutes after the first wave of heavily armed federal agents had successfully breached the perimeter, but I was no longer wearing the soft, unassuming silk of a marginalized decorator. I was clad in a sharp, uncompromising charcoal gray tactical blazer, prominently displaying a high-level federal expert consultant credential, and carrying a titanium-encased laptop containing the undeniable mathematical blueprints of their absolute ruination. As I walked through the chaotic, panic-stricken lobby, past the paralyzed secretaries and the frantic, sobbing vice presidents who were currently watching their careers evaporate in real time, I felt a sense of cold, industrial serenity. I bypassed the cordoned-off executive elevators and ascended directly to the boardroom, where Arthur and Leo were currently being restrained by grim-faced federal agents as a secondary team of cyberforensics experts began systematically stripping the encrypted servers of every single fraudulent byte of data. The look of unadulterated, wide-eyed bewilderment on Leo's face as I walked into the room was a masterpiece of psychological disintegration. He genuinely believed I was there to fix the records, desperately shouting my name as if I were his final, pathetic life raft in an ocean of impending litigation. "Maya, thank God. Tell these idiots that there's been a massive technical misunderstanding. Tell them about the aesthetic modifications we discussed." He screamed, his voice cracking with a high-pitched, feminine desperation that echoed through the silent, glass-walled chamber. I didn't respond to his pathetic pleas. Instead, I walked directly to the head of the table, opened my laptop, and projected a high-resolution, officially notarized digital certificate from the National Board of Structural Engineering directly onto the massive, wall-mounted display screens. The room fell into a deafening, absolute silence as my father, Arthur, stared at the bold, undeniable lettering that officially identified me not as Maya Sterling, the interior decorator, but as Dr. Maya Sterling, PhD in structural engineering and chief forensic consultant for the Municipal Building Integrity Task Force. The absolute, soul-crushing realization that the daughter they had treated as an intellectual lightweight for 26 years was actually the very person who had just authorized the permanent, non-negotiable decertification of their multi-billion-dollar empire was enough to turn my father's face a ghostly, translucent shade of gray. I then calmly activated the audio recording of their illegal bribe from the previous evening, the high-fidelity speakers broadcasting their own desperate, trembling voices as they explicitly asked me to commit federal document forgery to hide the structural rot of the Meridian Spire. "You called me a decorator because you were too intellectually arrogant to understand the mathematics of your own business," I stated, my voice cutting through their paralyzed shock like a diamond-tipped saw through substandard steel. "You assumed I was picking out curtains while I was actually documenting every single microscopic fracture you were building into this city's skyline. And today, the laws of physics are finally coming to collect their debt." As the lead federal agent stepped forward to officially read them their constitutional rights and secure the heavy, steel handcuffs around their wrists, I watched with a serene, mathematical detachment as the Sterling family legacy was officially, legally decapitated by the very person they thought was too insignificant to notice the cracks in the foundation. The immediate, systemic disintegration of a multi-billion-dollar real estate empire is a spectacular, mathematically predictable phenomenon that occurs when the foundational pillars of trust and structural integrity are simultaneously vaporized. Following the high-definition, televised federal decapitation of the Sterling Development's executive leadership, the global financial markets reacted with the violent, uncompromising speed of a shark, scenting a mortal wound in the water. I sat within the absolute, clinical silence of my subterranean command center, watching through my high-performance monitors as the company's publicly traded valuation entered a state of terminal, unrecoverable freefall, hemorrhaging hundreds of millions of dollars in institutional shareholder value with every frantic, panicked tick of the global exchange. Arthur and Leo, currently entombed within the sterile, unforgiving environment of a federal holding facility, were being subjected to the agonizing reality of cross-default clauses, a series of lethal, hidden financial triggers I had meticulously identified months prior within their labyrinthine commercial loan agreements. Because the Meridian Spire, the primary collateral for nearly 70% of their operational capital, was now officially, legally decertified as a hazardous structural entity, every single major lender and institutional bank simultaneously executed their right to immediate, non-negotiable repayment. I did not merely watch their bank accounts evaporate. I utilized my newly appointed status as the municipal forensic auditor to freeze their personal liquid assets, ensuring that not a single cent of their ill-gotten wealth could be utilized to hire the high-priced, morally bankrupt legal mercenaries they so desperately required to fight the impending forgery charges. Their private jet was grounded by federal order. Their fleet of custom-built luxury vehicles was systematically impounded by the IRS. And even the sprawling $90 million sterling family estate was officially placed under a judicial lien, effectively transforming the once untouchable monarchs of the skyline into penniless pariahs before their first preliminary hearing had even commenced. While they were sitting on cold, stainless steel benches in a holding cell, arguing about which one of them was more responsible for their collective destruction, I was busy executing the secondary phase of the Sterling family's architectural erasure. Utilizing an anonymous, heavily fortified holding company, I began aggressively acquiring the deeply discounted, toxic debt bonds of the Meridian Spire from the panicked secondary markets. To the rest of the world, the building was a vertical liability, a trillion-ton tomb of substandard steel and pending litigation. But to me, the woman who had already engineered the exact metallurgical solutions required to fix the structural rot, it was a multi-billion-dollar asset waiting to be reclaimed at a 90% discount. I wasn't just destroying their company. I was surgically extracting the physical heart of their legacy and preparing to transplant it into my own, sovereign corporate entity. By the time the sun set on the third day of their incarceration, the name Sterling had become a radioactive contagion that every architect, contractor, and investor in the city was frantically attempting to scrub from their professional records. They had spent decades telling me that I was just a decorator, a superficial accessory to their real work, but as I watched the final digital liquidation of their personal fortune flicker across my screen, I realized that I had successfully redefined the entire concept of renovation. I hadn't just changed the wallpaper. I had completely dismantled the structural foundation of their lives, and the most satisfying part was knowing that I was the only person with the blueprints to rebuild it. The physical environment of a federal holding facility is a masterclass in psychological and architectural sterility, designed with the explicit intent of stripping an individual of their perceived status and reducing their existence to a series of cold, alphanumeric identifiers. Sitting on the opposite side of the reinforced, bulletproof glass partition in the high-security visiting wing, I watched with a serene, mathematical detachment as my brother, Leo, was escorted into the room by two expressionless marshals, his previously immaculate, custom-tailored persona replaced by a coarse, ill-fitting orange jumpsuit and a face that had aged 20 years in less than a week. The look of frantic, desperate hope that momentarily flickered in his bloodshot eyes as he saw me was the most pathetic manifestation of his delusional arrogance I had ever witnessed. He still believed, in his profound, sweat-soaked ignorance, that I was there to offer him a familial lifeline or a technical loophole. Maya, thank God. You have to talk to the board of directors. You have to tell the banks that the Meridian Spire is salvageable. My lawyers say that if we can get a certified engineer to sign off on a remediation plan, we can secure an emergency bridge loan to cover the margin calls. He hissed into the intercom, his voice a ragged, high-pitched tremolo of unadulterated terror. I waited for him to finish his desperate, incoherent monologue, looking at him with eyes that had analyzed thousands of structural failures and knew exactly when a foundation was beyond repair. "I am not here to salvage your legacy, Leo. I am here to finalize its demolition," I stated, my voice possessing a clinical, terrifyingly calm resonance that instantly caused him to visibly recoil against the plastic chair. I then leaned forward, pressing a series of legally notarized acquisition documents against the glass, documents that officially identified my private holding company, Sterling Null LLC, as the primary, undisputed owner of his personal residence, his luxury vehicle collection, and nearly 90% of the outstanding debt bonds for the Meridian Spire project. "You spent years calling me a decorator, telling me to focus on the pretty little pillows, while you handled the real engineering of this empire. But you were too intellectually incompetent to realize that I was secretly buying the very ground you were standing on. I didn't just report your structural crimes to the authorities. I systematically, legally purchased your entire life at a 90% discount while you were busy drinking champagne and celebrating a topping-out ceremony for a building that was mathematically designed to kill people." The blood drained from Leo's face with a violent, instantaneous velocity, leaving behind a ghostly, translucent mask of pure, unmitigated horror, as the catastrophic magnitude of his situation finally penetrated his thick, arrogant skull. He realized in that exact microsecond that I wasn't just his sister, or a disgruntled former employee, or even just the engineer who exposed him. I was now his landlord, his primary creditor, and the person who would decide exactly how many decades he would spend in a concrete cell. "You wanted a world-class architectural legacy, Leo, and you've finally achieved it. You will spend the next 20 years of your life living inside a structure specifically designed to keep frauds like you exactly where they belong, while I spend your stolen fortune rebuilding this city with the integrity and the physics you were too arrogant to understand." I stood up, adjusting my blazer and signaling the guards to take him away, leaving him screaming and pounding his fists against the glass in a state of absolute, weeping psychological collapse. The decorator had finished her assessment of the room, and as I walked out into the crisp afternoon air, I realized that the most satisfying part of structural engineering isn't just building something that lasts. It's having the power to decide exactly which rotten foundations need to be ground into the dust. The profound, suffocating weight of a collapsed dynasty is perhaps most visibly etched into the weathered, translucent skin of a patriarch who has outlived his own manufactured reputation. Exactly 1 week after my brother Leo's absolute psychological disintegration in the federal visiting wing, I requested a final, private audience with my father, Arthur Sterling, within the clinical, soundproofed confines of the legal council chamber. As I entered the room, I found him seated at the end of the long, industrial-grade steel table, the once indomitable architect of the city's skyline, now reduced to a frail, trembling ghost of his former self, his expensive bespoke tailoring replaced by the humiliating, anonymous uniformity of a federal inmate's jumpsuit. He didn't look at me with the fiery, uncompromising authority that had defined my entire childhood. Instead, he stared at his shackled wrists with a profound sense of cognitive dissonance, as if he were still trying to mentally reconcile how his artistic, insignificant daughter had successfully orchestrated the total systemic annihilation of his 40-year corporate legacy. "Maya," he whispered, his voice a dry, papery rasp that barely carried across the sterile vacuum of the room. "I have spent my entire adult life building the Sterling name into a monument of unshakable architectural power, and I truly believed that by handing the reins to Leo, I was securing that legacy for another generation. I realize now that I was blind to his metallurgical shortcuts and his financial deceptions. But surely, as a Sterling, you cannot truly intend to let our entire history be liquidated and sold for scrap metal to the highest bidder." I sat down opposite him, not with the submissive posture of the daughter he had consistently marginalized, but with the cold, unwavering presence of a sovereign liquidator who had already mathematically calculated his erasure. "You didn't build a legacy, Arthur. You built a facade of reinforced arrogance that was structurally dependent on my silent, uncredited engineering expertise to keep it from collapsing under the weight of your son's incompetence. I replied, my voice slicing through his pathetic appeal to family loyalty with a diamond-tipped precision. I then placed a single, thick legal document on the table, the official, court-certified certificate of dissolution for Sterling Developments, alongside a secondary filing that permanently, irrevocably dissolved the Sterling name from every patent, deed, and corporate entity I had recently acquired. The reason I am here is not to offer you a reconciliation or a second chance. I am here to have you officially witness the death certificate of your empire. I have already begun the process of stripping the Sterling name from the Meridian Spire and rebranding the entire portfolio under Neurovance Global, an organization that recognizes actual, verified engineering credentials over unearned hereditary titles. My father's eyes widened in a state of unadulterated, weeping horror as the realization finally took hold. I wasn't just taking over the business. I was surgically removing his name from the very city he thought he owned. "You're erasing me," he choked out, his hands beginning to shake violently as the marshals stepped forward to signal the end of the session. "I'm not erasing you, Arthur. I'm simply correcting a 40-year-old engineering error," I stated, standing up and looking down at him with a serenity that was entirely devoid of malice or regret. "You told me I was just a decorator who didn't understand the physics of a building, so consider this my final design choice. I've decided that your legacy is an eyesore that needs to be permanently removed from the landscape." As he was led away, his pathetic cries echoing through the sterile corridor, I realized that the most important structural renovation isn't about what you add to a building. It's about what you have the courage to tear down so that something authentic can finally take its place. The profound, industrial silence that had enveloped the Meridian Spire for months, a silence born from the catastrophic, televised decapitation of the Sterling family's unearned reputation, was officially, violently shattered on a cold, overcast Monday morning. Standing at the base of the 72-story skeletal monolith, I looked up at the rusting crane arms and the abandoned scaffolding, no longer viewing it as a vertical monument to my brother's incompetence, but as a raw, multi-billion-dollar canvas for my own definitive structural masterpiece. I did not arrive in an unassuming vehicle. I coordinated my triumphant, highly calculated return accompanied by a synchronized fleet of heavy-duty industrial transport vehicles, carrying thousands of tons of military-grade, carbon fiber-reinforced structural steel, and specialized seismic dampening, arrays that Leo had been too arrogant and too intellectually cheap to ever consider. As I stepped out onto the rain-slicked concrete of the construction site, clad in high-performance technical gear and wearing a custom-engineered titanium hard hat that bore the unmistakable insignia of Neurovance Global, the remaining construction crews, the very men who had previously dismissed me as just a decorator, while they took orders from my incompetent brother, stood in a state of paralyzed, absolute reverence. They watched in stunned silence as I bypassed the traditional corporate liaison and marched directly to the central command trailer, where the site's senior foremen and structural inspectors were frantically reviewing the court-mandated remediation orders. I didn't offer them a polite introduction. I opened my encrypted, high-performance workstation and projected a series of complex, high-fidelity metallurgical simulations that made Leo's original blueprints look like amateurish finger paintings. Utilizing the fundamental principles of advanced structural physics, I explicitly demonstrated the exact mathematical correction required to stabilize the building's cantilevered residential wings, which I calculated using the formula for axial stress distribution. \sigma equals \frac PA plus \frac my I$. I explained to the gathered technical elite that by integrating high-tension alloy reinforcements at the precise nodal stress points I had identified years ago, we wouldn't just be saving the spire. We would be creating the most seismically resilient structure in the history of the Pacific Northwest. The Sterling era of aesthetic shortcuts and fraudulent metallurgical substitutions is officially, permanently over, I stated, my voice cutting through the ambient roar of the idling machinery with a clinical, terrifyingly precise resonance. From this microsecond forward, We are not building for visual impact or social media recognition. We are building according to the uncompromising laws of physics and the absolute certainty of forensic engineering. I then personally authorized the immediate, non-negotiable termination of every single contractor and vendor who had previously participated in Leo's kickback schemes, replacing them with elite, meticulously vetted technical teams I had secretly recruited during my years in the Decorator shadows. As the first massive, reinforced steel beams were hoisted into the gray sky, I felt a sense of cold, profound satisfaction. I was no longer the invisible ghost reinforcing a brittle foundation. I was the undisputed queen of the skyline, physically and mathematically proving that the woman they had treated as a superficial accessory was the only one with the intellectual capacity to keep their entire world from crashing into the dirt. The workers who once laughed at my wallpaper samples were now scurrying to execute my every technical command with a level of frantic, terrified precision that bordered on the religious, finally understanding that a PhD in structural engineering is a far more powerful instrument of control than an inherited surname. I stood on the edge of the open floor plate on the 50th level, the wind whipping through the skeletal frame, looking out at the city that would soon be defined by my name and my designs, and I realized that the greatest decoration I could ever provide for this city was the cold, unyielding truth of a foundation that could never be broken. The profound, agonizing psychological attrition inherent in witnessing your own meticulously constructed identity being systematically dismantled and replaced by the very individual you once deemed intellectually insignificant is a specialized form of torture that few truly survive with their sanity intact. Inside the sterile, gray-walled confines of the Federal Correctional Facility, the atmosphere is a permanent, institutionalized vacuum of despair, a far cry from the velvet-lined penthouses and champagne-soaked boardrooms where Arthur and Leo Sterling once presided as the undisputed monarchs of the city's skyline. On a flickering, low-resolution television monitor in the communal area, surrounded by the predatory, indifferent gazes of other inmates, a national financial news segment was currently broadcasting a high-definition, panoramic aerial tour of the newly completed Meridian Spire, now officially rebranded as the Sovereign Technical Center. The news anchor, speaking with a reverent, breathless enthusiasm, was detailing the unprecedented, miraculous structural rescue operation orchestrated by Dr. Maya Sterling, whom they were now hailing as the most significant architectural visionary of the 21st century. Leo sat hunched on a cold, bolted-down plastic chair, his eyes bulging and his skin a sallow, sickly shade of yellow under the harsh fluorescent lights, watching in a state of unadulterated, weeping rage as the screen featured a close-up of me standing on the 72nd floor observation deck, clad in a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit that radiated an aura of unassailable sovereign power. The broadcast explicitly, mercilessly detailed how I had utilized my clandestine PhD in structural engineering to identify and neutralize over 3,000 separate points of catastrophic, criminally negligent metallurgical failure originally embedded by the incompetent former management, a phrase that felt like a jagged, rusted blade being slowly twisted into Leo's already shattered ego. Every time the reporter mentioned the name, Sterling's, it was in the context of the massive, multi-billion-dollar criminal trial and the structural rot of the old regime, whereas my name was now synonymous with the city's future and its architectural integrity. My father, Arthur, sat in a corner of the infirmary nearby, his mind slowly slipping into a catatonic state of cognitive dissonance, unable to reconcile the image of the Decorator daughter he had marginalized for decades with the global titan who was currently receiving a Lifetime Achievement Award from the International Board of Architects. The most exquisite part of their psychological demolition was the knowledge that every single dollar of profit generated by the now thriving Spire was being funneled into Neurovance Global, the company I owned entirely, while they were forced to barter for basic necessities in a concrete cage. They were being subjected to the ultimate, absolute form of erasure. I hadn't just taken their building and their money, I had hijacked their very history, ensuring that in every architectural textbook and news archive, they would be remembered only as the pathetic, intellectually bankrupt villains who were too arrogant to notice the genius sitting right in front of them. Leo violently lunged at the television, screaming incoherent, high-pitched obscenities at my image until he was forcefully, aggressively tackled and restrained by 4 heavily armed correctional officers, his pathetic cries for recognition echoing through the indifferent, concrete halls. I watched the smuggled footage of his breakdown on my encrypted smartphone from the comfort of my executive suite, sipping an aged vintage wine, and I realized that the greatest decoration I ever added to their lives was the cold, unyielding bars of a federal cell, a structure whose integrity I personally verified would never, ever fail. The grand, high-definition unveiling of the Sovereign Technical Center, the 72-story architectural masterpiece, formerly known as the structurally compromised Meridian Spire, represented the absolute, undisputed culmination of my 3-year campaign of systemic, metallurgical retribution. As the sun began to set over the Pacific Northwest, casting a deep, golden-orange hue across the building's innovative, light-diffracting glass facade, the surrounding city plaza was congested with thousands of elite international architects, high-stakes institutional investors, and global media outlets, all gathered to witness the official resurrection of a structure that was once considered a vertical death trap. I stood on a private, glass-floored observation deck, projecting nearly 30 feet out from the building's 65th floor, feeling the microscopic, almost imperceptible rhythmic vibration of the massive seismic dampening systems I had personally engineered to counteract the region's volatile tectonic activity. This building was no longer a hollow monument to Leo's unearned arrogance. It was a living, breathing technological organism, integrated with a multi-layered network of over 50,000 fiber-optic sensors that monitored structural stress and load distribution in real time, utilizing the fundamental principles of the Euler-Bernoulli beam theory to ensure mathematical perfection. EI/frac D4WDX4 equals Q x $. Below me, on the massive digital marquee that wrapped around the building's base, the name Sterling was nowhere to be found, having been systematically, legally scrubbed from every zoning permit, deed of trust, and commemorative plaque by a specialized team of my proprietary legal liquidators. The city's topographical records had been officially updated to reflect that the entire district was now the sovereign territory of Neurovance Global, effectively erasing 40 years of my father's corporate history in a single, comprehensive bureaucratic sweep. As the mayor and the chief building commissioner approached the podium to officially hand me the golden key of structural excellence, I felt a cold, industrial sense of satisfaction that transcended simple emotional revenge. I wasn't just a successful CEO. I was the singular, undisputed architect of the city's new reality, the woman who had turned a decorator's marginalization into a doctorate of absolute, unshakable control. The very people who had once whispered about my insignificant artistic hobbies, while I was picking out wallpaper, were now desperately clutching their prestigious invitations, hopping for a mere 30 seconds of my time to discuss their own failing development projects. I looked out over the skyline, seeing the other Sterling-built towers in the distance, and I realized they were all now structurally vulnerable, their integrity managed by the same outdated, flawed methodologies that had destroyed Arthur and Leo. They didn't realize it yet, but the Sovereign Technical Center was just the first phase of my plan. I was going to systematically audit, decertify, and acquire every single structure that bore my father's name, rebuilding the entire city according to the laws of physics and the unyielding certainty of my own engineering genius. The Sterling legacy was a rotting foundation that had finally been ground into dust, and in its place, I was constructing an empire of steel and logic that would remain standing long after the world had forgotten that a man named Arthur Sterling ever dared to call me just a decorator. I stepped toward the microphone, the silence of the crowd becoming absolute and heavy, and as I prepared to deliver my final, televised address to the world, I felt the flawless, resonant hum of the building beneath my feet, a structural symphony that only I could hear, and only I could control. The ultimate finality of a perfectly executed structural demolition is not found in the thunderous roar of collapsing concrete or the twisted skeletal remains of substandard steel, but in the profound, absolute silence that follows the permanent erasure of a fraudulent name from the annals of history. Standing in the center of my sprawling, minimalist executive sanctuary atop the Sovereign Technical Center, a 72-story fortress of logic and engineering that I essentially willed into existence, I am surrounded by the humming, luminescent servers of Neurovance Global, the multi-billion-dollar hegemony I built from the ashes of the Sterling family's unearned arrogance. Exactly 3 years after I was publicly humiliated and dismissed as just a decorator by my intellectually bankrupt brother and my complicit, delusional father, the name Sterling has been officially, legally reclassified as a historical synonym for structural malpractice and systemic corporate rot. I recently received the final, non-appealable administrative notification from the Federal Bureau of Prisons regarding inmate 99,280.3011 and inmate 99,280.3012. Arthur and Leo have been permanently transferred to a maximum security industrial facility in the Midwest, where they will spend the next 2 decades contributing their only remaining physical utility to the manufacturing of heavy-duty drainage pipes. A poetic, metallurgical irony for 2 men who once believed they were destined to touch the clouds. I did not send them a parting letter of reconciliation or a final gesture of familial forgiveness. Instead, I sent them a high-definition digital rendering of the completed spire, along with a certified engineering report proving that the building's current resonance frequency, calculated as Fn equals \frac12 /pi, is so perfectly calibrated that it will remain standing for 3 centuries after their names have been entirely forgotten by the world. My father's 40-year legacy was a facade of reinforced ego, but my empire is a crystalline manifestation of the laws of physics, an unshakable foundation built on the very technical expertise they were too misogynistic to recognize. Neurovance Global now holds the exclusive, sovereign patents for the most advanced seismic dampening technology on the planet, and every single developer who once looked down on me as a glorified interior designer is now desperately groveling for a chance to pay millions just to have my engineers audit their blueprints. I am Dr. Maya Sterling, and I have effectively redefined the topographical and moral landscape of this city, proving with cold, mathematical certainty that the person you choose to marginalize today will be the one who decides whether your entire world stands or falls tomorrow. If you have been captivated by this monumental, 13-part odyssey of architectural betrayal, high-stakes forensic engineering, and the ultimate, calculated destruction of an arrogant family dynasty, then you are the reason I document these retaliatory operations. You have witnessed the exact structural failure of a bully's ego and the rise of a sovereign architect who refused to yield a single millimeter of her sanctuary. Smash that like button, subscribe to the Revenge Room, and permanently activate your notifications so you never miss a single instance of spectacular, high-definition karma. Remember, the world might call you a decorator or a failure today, but if you understand the underlying physics of power, you can rebuild your life into a monument that no one can ever tear down. I have finished my final design, and the result is absolute perfection. I will see you in the next story. The ultimate finality of a perfectly executed structural demolition is not found in the thunderous roar of collapsing concrete or the twisted skeletal remains of substandard steel, but in the profound, absolute silence that follows the permanent erasure of a fraudulent name from the annals of history. Standing in the center of my sprawling, minimalist executive sanctuary atop the Sovereign Technical Center, a 72-story fortress of logic and engineering that I essentially willed into existence, I am surrounded by the humming, luminescent servers of Neurovance Global, the multi-billion-dollar hegemony I built from the ashes of the Sterling family's unearned arrogance. Exactly 3 years after I was publicly humiliated and dismissed as just a decorator by my intellectually bankrupt brother and my complicit, delusional father, The name sterling has been officially, legally reclassified as a historical synonym for structural malpractice and systemic corporate rot. I recently received the final, non-appealable administrative notification from the Federal Bureau of Prisons regarding inmate 99,280.3011 and inmate 99,280.3012. Arthur and Leo have been permanently transferred to a maximum security industrial facility in the Midwest, where they will spend the next 2 decades contributing their only remaining physical utility to the manufacturing of heavy-duty drainage pipes. A poetic, metallurgical irony for 2 men who once believed they were destined to touch the clouds. I did not send them a parting letter of reconciliation or a final gesture of familial forgiveness. Instead, I sent them a high-definition digital rendering of the completed spire, along with a certified engineering report proving that the building's current resonance frequency, calculated as Fn equals /frac12 /pi, is so perfectly calibrated that it will remain standing for 3 centuries after their names have been entirely forgotten by the world. My father's 40-year legacy was a facade of reinforced ego, but my empire is a crystalline manifestation of the laws of physics, an unshakable foundation built on the very technical expertise they were too misogynistic to recognize. Neurovance Global now holds the exclusive, sovereign patents for the most advanced seismic dampening technology on the planet, and every single developer who once looked down on me as a glorified interior designer is now desperately groveling for a chance to pay millions just to have my engineers audit their blueprints. I am Dr. Maya Sterling, and I have effectively redefined the topographical and moral landscape of this city, proving with cold, mathematical certainty that the person you choose to marginalize today will be the one who decides whether your entire world stands or falls tomorrow. The ultimate finality of a perfectly executed structural demolition is not found in the thunderous roar of collapsing concrete or the twisted skeletal remains of substandard steel, but in the profound, absolute silence that follows the permanent erasure of a fraudulent name from the annals of history. Standing in the center of my sprawling, minimalist executive sanctuary atop the Sovereign Technical Center, a 72-story fortress of logic and engineering that I essentially willed into existence, I am surrounded by the humming, luminescent servers of Neurovance Global, the multi-billion-dollar hegemony I built from the ashes of the Sterling family's unearned arrogance. Exactly 3 years after I was publicly humiliated and dismissed as just a decorator by my intellectually bankrupt brother and my complicit, delusional father, the name Sterling has been officially, legally reclassified as a historical synonym for structural malpractice and systemic corporate rot. I recently received the final, non-appealable administrative notification from the Federal Bureau of Prisons regarding inmate 99,280.3011 and inmate 99,280.3012. Arthur and Leo have been permanently transferred to a maximum security industrial facility in the Midwest, where they will spend the next 2 decades contributing their only remaining physical utility to the manufacturing of heavy-duty drainage pipes. A poetic, metallurgical irony for 2 men who once believed they were destined to touch the clouds. I did not send them a parting letter of reconciliation or a final gesture of familial forgiveness. Instead, I sent them a high-definition digital rendering of the completed spire, along with a certified engineering report proving that the building's current resonance frequency, calculated as Fn equals /frac12 /pi, is so perfectly calibrated that it will remain standing for 3 centuries after their names have been entirely forgotten by the world. My father's 40-year legacy was a facade of reinforced ego, but my empire is a crystalline manifestation of the laws of physics, an unshakable foundation built on the very technical expertise they were too misogynistic to recognize. Neurovance Global now holds the exclusive, sovereign patents for the most advanced seismic dampening technology on the planet, and every single developer who once looked down on me as a glorified interior designer is now desperately groveling for a chance to pay millions just to have my engineers audit their blueprints. I am Dr. Maya Sterling, and I have effectively redefined the topographical and moral landscape of this city, proving with cold, mathematical certainty that the person you choose to marginalize today will be the one who decides whether your entire world stands or falls tomorrow. If you have been captivated by this monumental, 13-part odyssey of architectural betrayal, high-stakes forensic engineering, and the ultimate, calculated destruction of an arrogant family dynasty, then you are the reason I document these retaliatory operations. You have witnessed the exact structural failure of a bully's ego and the rise of a sovereign architect who refused to yield a single millimeter of her sanctuary. Smash that like button, subscribe to the Revenge Room, and permanently activate your notifications so you never miss a single instance of spectacular, high-definition karma. Remember, the world might call you a decorator or a failure today, but if you understand the underlying physics of power, you can rebuild your life into a monument that no one can ever tear down. I have finished my final design, and the result is absolute perfection. I will see you in the next story.